It's very encouraging to hear, at least a couple of times in the last little while, some discussion at least that moves beyond the very, very important staple crops to some of the other commodities that are central to the agricultural landscape. And in particular, we heard this afternoon a very little touch on animals, and in particular animal source foods, as we are all aware, are from a nutritional perspective and from a food security perspective incredibly important. And I was very encouraged to hear Schengen Fan in the introductions today talking about the issues of micronutrient deficiency, the issues of hidden hunger, and all of those dimensions. And I think it's quite fitting that Marie Ruel, in one of the parallel sessions subsequently, will be talking some more about this issue of nutrition. And I put this slide up just to emphasize the key role that animal source foods in all their guises make in improving the quality of our health and nutrition. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but I think it's very important to recognize, and given my interest and affiliations, it'll be no surprise to learn that I'm particularly interested in the role of fish in improving food security, nutrition and health. And let me just give you a quick picture of the Arab region and ask about this question of fish supply. Supply and demand. Supply has to meet demand, and demand is growing very rapidly. It's growing through increased wealth, increased urbanization. And these two graphs here show you the relationship between farmed production at the top in the red line on the left graph, and wild production and farmed production, the graph below. And the key story here is, as many of you will be aware, the fish we catch from the wild are reaching the limits. We're really not going to get any more, and meeting the growing demand for fish will have to come from aquaculture, the farming of fish. And if we look at this particular region, there is an important story to be understood. And the first part of that is that aquaculture is of two components: those fish that are grown in freshwater and those fish that are grown in the sea. And that little bubble on the right-hand side there is the volume of production in this region that's grown in the sea. The vast majority of fish supply comes from freshwater, and the vast majority of that comes from Egypt. About 70-odd% of Africa's total production, indeed, comes from Egypt. Yet MENA as a whole is a very, very small proportion of the world total. And I'm not going to dwell too much on the basics of aquaculture because I want to drill down into one particular story, but there are some key messages you need. The first one is, more than anything else, aquaculture is a business. And while we often have romantic notions of fish farming, the fundamental drivers for investment in aquaculture, interest and enthusiasm for marine sea culture of fish, is largely misplaced. High capital costs and limited returns from what is usually an export focus to local economies really don't make it a sensible bet for this region. The other key message is that there are very few countries in this region that have meaningful potential to produce fish at scale. There are lots of opportunities to improve livelihoods through small-scale fish farming, but really very few that can produce at scale to meet that large-scale demand that's growing. And of those, only Egypt at the moment currently produces significant quantities of fish. And one of the explanations from that is from this graph, which talks about renewable water supply. And you can see that Egypt's fish production up there is certainly partly explained, I would argue, by the renewable water supply compared to a whole population of those at the bottom of the graph on the left-hand side. Iran clearly has considerable potential if one uses renewable water supply as an explanatory variable. In that case, however, markets and market demands probably constrain production, and post-conflict circumstances in Sudan speak to a huge potential, but unrealized as yet. Schengen Fan talked about, and as indeed Mood, talked about some new large programmatic investments by the CGIAR, and one of those is around meeting this challenge of increasing animal source foods at affordable prices for poor consumers. And one of the nice features of that program is a very, very definite focus on taking that high-level research down into specific countries and specific value chains using a prioritized set of criteria for investment. And out of those criteria and that process, we at the World Fish Centre with our partners identified Egypt as one of the key places where there was potential to increase supply at scale to meet local and regional needs. A little bit of a history here of Egyptian aquaculture from 97 till about 2007. You know, it grew from about 50,000 tons to 700,000 tons of fish. It's 75% of Africa's aquaculture. It employs about 200,000 people, supports between 500,000 and 1 million livelihoods through the family members. And per capita consumption has gone up quite dramatically across the country. The very interesting story is told with this graph, which shows at the top right how the supply at the top from wild capture and imports and exports has really not changed since 1996. Wild capture has stagnated, imports are about the same, but aquaculture has gone through the roof. The second graph there on the top right, shows you what the supply would have been per capita if aquaculture, fish farming, had not been in place in Egypt. And this all relates to one species. This is tilapia, by far the most important species in Egypt. And the bottom figure there shows how price, which was creeping up into the late 1990s, actually started to decline subsequently as the volume of production increased. And an important part of the Egyptian story is this is a product for poor consumers in Egypt. In fact, tilapia is about 30% cheaper than any other animal source food, including chicken and other meats. So it's a very important dietary component for poor consumers in the Arab world, or specifically in Egypt. Now, through several strategic partnerships over a period of time, and our presence in WorldFish has been about the last decade or more, we're now in a position to pursue in rather more detail some of the issues around the constraints to further increasing and indeed doubling the supply of fish in Egypt to meet the demand and the strategic imperatives that the government have set. Thinking through this in the context of this value chain perspective, which asks where the key impediments really are. And in doing that, we've been able to, in the last few months indeed, really dig down rather deeper into the structural features of the value chain in aquaculture. And it's given us, I think, some very valuable insights about how investments in this sector can achieve the objectives that are recognised by the government and others. And the key findings out of that are, I think, quite revealing. The first is, you know, this is a production system where there really aren't very few exports. It's a very short and simple value chain. There's almost no processing of live fish. They're all sold fresh or live. There's very little spoilage. And for every 100 tons that are produced, it's employing around 14 or so full-time employees. They're evenly divided between the youth and older workers, and females are really only employed in the retail sector. And producers themselves get about 72% of the final consumer price. So there's some real dynamism in this, but it's really quite a simple setting at present. The key constraints around this are some that Mahmoud alluded to and that others have at a more strategic level around productivity and factor costs. Feed and the feeding efficiency of management practices have got huge potential through improvement to improve productivity, and in particular the improvement of inputs in terms of improved strains, improved breeds of fish fry for stocking, and the management of that also offer tremendous opportunity as well. And all of this, I think, is perfectly doable, and indeed we've made considerable progress already. Pictures paint 1,000 words. If you look at the picture on the left, the fish on the scale at 251 grams compared to the one at 139 grams is a consequence of about 5 or 6 years of selective breeding of an improved strain for a bassa in Egypt at our facility there, which is now ready for release and will have quite profound impacts on the productivity of the sector, provided we can get all those other linkages to supply feed in place. Similarly, on the right, great progress in terms of capacity building and training. These are the numbers of trainees that have been through our facility at Abassa, specifically around aquaculture production. We've made progress in modernising the industry by improving technologies and building capacities. We understand what the critical factors are there, and progress has been made, but the potential for that and the progress that can be made with more investment is quite considerable. Looking forward, I think that there is a really interesting possibility that we need to think about around the potential for Egypt to serve a regional market for supplying affordable fish to poor consumers. I think we need to invest in trying to understand where regional demand isn't being met, and many of Egypt's neighbours would qualify under that basis. Identify the barriers that there are currently to meeting the supply in these markets and the strategies for overcoming them, and the policy settings that are required, as indeed we've identified some of the policy settings that are required that constrain domestic growth right now. And identify those specific interventions that would make those value chains more efficient, whether that's cold chain, whether that's information systems, whether it's producer and retailer networks of the kind that we know can work elsewhere. So my message to you is threefold. The first one is, when you're thinking about food security, think about nutrition and health, not just calories. When you think about nutrition and health, animal source foods really matter. And when you think about animal source foods, don't forget fish. Aquaculture is one of the fastest growing food production sectors in the world. It does have tremendous potential. There are limits to where it can apply as a producer in this part of the world, but where it's invested in, it has the potential to serve a much wider region. And with that, I think I'll shut up. Thank you.